Good evening and welcome to Bard Graduate Center. My name is Nadia Rivers. Welcome to Collectively Imagining De-Gentrifying and Abolitionist Futures, a panel discussion curated and moderated by Chinatown Art Brigade. I'm Nadia Rivers, coordinator of public programs, education, and engagement. I'm a Black woman with dark curly hair. I have black cat eye glasses. I am wearing gold earrings and a gold necklace and a black top and sweater. Before introducing our speakers and general housekeeping, I'd like to begin with a land acknowledgement. While we have the privilege of convening virtually today, we also have the responsibility to acknowledge that many cities, institutions in America were founded on the exclusions and erasures of many Indigenous peoples, including those whose land, Mannahatta, from which this event is hosted. The land of the 5 boroughs that makes up New York City are the traditional homelands of the Lenape, Merrick, Canarsie, and Matinecock, and Rockaway nations. Despite systemic erasures, these lands persist as intertribal trade lands under the stewardship of many nations and over 115,000 intertribal Native American, First Nations, and Indigenous peoples who currently live in New York City. In addition, I would like to acknowledge those here today whose ancestors did not arrive of these lands on their own free will, and whose tremendous cultural, economic, and technological contributions continue to provide the foundation for our lives. Some housekeeping for today. You can use the chat function to offer appreciations, but we would like to reserve the use of the Q&A that you'll find on the lower right corner of your screen for questions during the Q&A session. You can also enable closed captioning by selecting the CC box in the lower right-hand corner of your screen. I'm going to hand it over to Betty Yu of Chinatown Art Brigade. Thank you so much for being here tonight.
Thanks so much, Nadia. I really appreciate the land acknowledgement and the opening. And thanks for hosting the second session. So my name is Betty Yu. I use she, her pronouns. I am an Asian American woman with long black hair. And I'm really excited that you all are here for this very important conversation. I'm here with my colleague Linda as well, who they will introduce themselves in a minute after I just tell you a little bit about Chinatown Art Brigade. Again, tonight's conversation, Collectively Imagining De-Gentrified and Abolitionist Futures, is co-hosted by Chinatown Art Brigade and with support from the Bard Graduate Center. Chinatown Art Brigade is an intergenerational collective driven by the fundamental belief that our cultural, material, and aesthetic modes of production have the power to advance social change. Chinatown Art Brigade is comprised of Asian American and Asian diasporic identifying visual artists, media makers, writers, educators, organizers and tenants as well from Chinatown with deep roots in Manhattan's Chinatown. Together, we make work that centers art and culture as a way to support community-led organizing against gentrification, displacement, and racialized capitalism. We know that the systems of state-sanctioned gentrification and mass displacement are absolutely tied and part of the same system of the prison industrial complex that incarcerates, criminalizes, and perpetuates state-sanctioned violence against communities of color. So just to read a short little sort of excerpt from our event description, just to underscore that, our nation has been confronting dual pandemics, right, of COVID-19 and structural racism. And of course, the latter has been for many, many centuries, if not longer. But what does it truly mean to reckon, reclaim, and envision a liberated future for all of us through a decolonized and de-gentrified and abolitionist framework? As we know, our communities, Black, Indigenous, and all communities of color have been suffering from racialized capitalism long before the pandemic. We know that the COVID-19 pandemic has exacerbated land displacement, rent burden, economic inequality, and police violence. And so at this time, we find ourselves really facing some really sort of dark dystopian times, but it's also compelled us in the last 16 months to think outside of the box, to reimagine a radically different society, one that is more just, that upholds our common racial, economic, and social justice values. I'm going to pass it to my colleague, Linda, to provide a framework, and then we're going to get right into the speakers tonight. Thank you for being here.
Thanks, Betty. Welcome, everybody. Hi, my name is Linda. I am an Asian person. I have my hair up in a bun, and I'm wearing black glasses and a gray collared shirt with some patterns on it, and there's some plants in my background. I'm really excited to have these speakers here with us together to help us think about de-gentrified and abolitionist futures together. Something that prison abolitionists often say, and that Ruth Wilson Gilmore has put so clearly for us, is that abolition requires that we change one thing, and that's everything. And so just to kind of ground us in how we're using abolition, we see abolition as a political vision and a practice that has been shaped by the Black radical tradition and generations of Black freedom fighters, which demands that the abolition of all forms of policing and police, because it recognizes that police itself is the problem. And that means that abolition requires the fundamental redefinition of safety and justice away from the police and the law and the courts as ways of dealing with our social, economic, political, and interpersonal problems, meaning that the entire foundation of our democratic political order that's built upon anti-Blackness, settler colonialism, and racial capitalism must be dismantled and radically rethought. And so if we refuse prisons as the kind of catch-all solutions to our social problems, a lot of people who are new to abolition sometimes ask about what we're going to do about XYZ problem that still exists and is not tended to, and that's exactly right. And that's why abolition is also about creating the kinds of structures and relations that we need to live together. And the other thing is that police exist to protect private property, and so abolition is about the abolition of the property form itself. And so it's a struggle that really needs to be articulated with decolonization and movements against gentrification, and thinking about how we, in joining Indigenous peoples in their struggles against ongoing settler colonialism here and across the globe, can be stewards for the land that we're on, which is not solely an Indigenous obligation, right? Although it needs to be accompanied by decolonization and rematriation. But it's also an obligation for and relation for those of us who are settlers to think about what is the relationship to the land that we are now on, and to also think about ways that people have cared for and used this land and continue to in ways that have not resulted in the building of carceral infrastructures, whether that's the physical building of a prison, but also all the kinds of social relationships that need to exist so that that is not ultimately the solution. And just to say a little bit about how this has manifested in Chinatown, over the past few years, Chinatown Art Brigade has focused our attention on the Museum of Chinese in America, which is an arts institution. It's a museum that has accepted a $35 million concession as part of the city's plan to build 4 new jails across the boroughs of New York City. And the museum has accepted that concession as part of finding a permanent home, a physical space for them to grow in the city. And so we really start to see the connections in this one kind of container. And Jonathan Chu, who sits on the board of the museum, is also the biggest landlord in Chinatown, and comes from a family that for generations has union busted and gentrified Chinatown. And so that's just to say that this stuff is very insidious and it happens in all the details. And it also demands that we really have a framework that's capacious enough to tackle and talk about all these things. And I think that decolonization and abolition are capacious enough to do that. And I'm really excited to have our speakers really just tell us more about the localized struggles and the context in which they are fighting these systems. And so I'll pass it back to Betty to tell us about the rundown of this event.
Cool. Yeah, again, tonight we'll highlight important cultural organizing work and grassroots activism that folks are doing. And I know there's a lot of expertise also in the space here in our virtual space. So when we get to the Q&A and discussion, please feel free to pipe in. But we'll be highlighting important organizing projects and campaigns that are unleashing our popular imagination and a shared vision for, as Linda articulated, an abolitionist and de-gentrified future. We hope to discuss concrete ways that we can build and enact this into the future. So in terms of for the next hour and change, is that you'll hear from all the presenters, and we do have some prepared questions that we wanted to ask the panelists, and we'll kind of have a little dialogue, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. So definitely feel free to when the time comes, jot those down in the webinar Q&A function. So I'm going to pass it back to Linda to introduce our first speakers.
Awesome. Okay, so I'm going to introduce Giselle Jimenez and Sean Lin from the Sunset Park Popular Assembly, which is an autonomous, self-managed, directly democratic space that centers the perspectives and interests of the popular sectors of Sunset Park, the tenants, workers, students, and their allies. It's a space for organizing, decision-making, and community building that is free from the control or influence from bosses, landlords, police, politicians, and political parties. Giselle Jimenez was born in Sunset Park, Brooklyn, to immigrant parents and raised there by her immigrant grandmother. Inspired by how their Dominican Taino heritage has managed to survive here in Lenapehoking, Giselle uplifts her family's traditional ways of preserving and sharing knowledge through her labor as an artist, educator, and organizer. Sean Lin is pursuing a PhD in geography at the CUNY Graduate Center, where his research interests include immigrant communities, food and foodways, and abolition geography. Originally from Los Angeles, Sean is a longtime resident of Sunset Park, Brooklyn, where he organizes with Sunset Park for a Liberated Future, Sunset Park Popular Assembly, Protect 8th Ave Coalition, and Protect 8th Ave Coalition previously with No New Jails, New York City, against gentrification, displacement, policing, and prisons. And I'll pass it over to Sean and Giselle.
Thank you so much for that generous introduction, Linda and Betty, and thank you, Nadia, for the land acknowledgement. It's a tremendous honor to be here speaking on this panel today. Sunset Park Popular Assembly is a pretty new formation, so yesterday Giselle and I had to check in to prepare for the panel, and it was really one of our opportunities to kind of evaluate how the work has gone, to think about where we wanted this organizing to grow when we had began this project. And this is a really wonderful opportunity to kind of reflect on and evaluate some of our work in the past year. I'm going to share a few slides. It's not very many. Some of them, they're mostly images and actually mostly maps. But yeah, just hoping that a few images are helpful. I should introduce myself. My name is Sean Lin. I use he, him pronouns. I have long black hair, which is tied up in a bun. I'm wearing clear plastic glasses, and I'm a man of Asian American descent. I'm going to share my screen now. Somebody please let me know if there's anything that's not working. So, one second. So yeah, I guess I don't need to really introduce myself since Linda already did that. So I guess I have three main goals of that I prepared to talk with folks about today. The first is really to situate us in the geography of Sunset Park, how our neighborhood has been impacted by policing and gentrification, and how these observations have informed our analysis of the relationship between policing and gentrification. The second point that I wanted to make was to give a brief history of the organizing that led into and that grew out of the Sunset Park Popular Assembly, including some of our earlier organizing projects as Sunset Park Cop Watch and Sunset Park for a Liberated Future. And third, while we're here at the Bard Grad Center, I was really hoping to open up a dialogue about the ways in which scholars and researchers can engage with, support, work with communities in an accountable way that is generative for folks on the ground. So I don't have any comments on that prepared, but I'm hoping that we can maybe talk about that a little bit in the discussion or in the Q&A. All right, so this is a map of redlining in Brooklyn. This map was created by the Mapping Inequality Project, which is a project out of the University of Richmond. And what folks there did was they took a bunch of data from the Homeowners Loan Corporation in around 1935 and 1940 and generated these maps of it. And what these maps really demonstrate is basically how home loans and home mortgages and home insurance were denied in particular places on maps. So this is a map of unceded Munsee, Lenape, and Canarsie land that we now call Brooklyn. I guess I'll try to orient some folks a little bit around Brooklyn just quickly. This right here that I'm circling with my mouse, it's a gray area kind of in the middle of the map of Brooklyn is Prospect Park. Directly underneath Prospect Park right here, to the left of it is Greenwood Cemetery. And Greenwood Cemetery, I often think of as like the northern border of Sunset Park. So Sunset Park is this neighborhood here, bordering Park Slope on its north side and Bay Ridge on its south side. You know, historically, Sunset Park was very much a neighborhood that grew out of its industrial waterfront. The early residents of Sunset Park were immigrants from Europe. They were immigrants from Northern Europe, Italy, and Ireland. And a lot of the work that happened there was around the ports on the Sunset Park waterfront. At some point in time, this was the largest port in the United States. This changed when the port of Newark was opened in the early 1930s. And what else do I want to say about that? I guess I would say that what this map shows is it shows redlining in Sunset Park, here red and yellow. But it also shows this redlining in a time in which the neighborhood was still predominantly white. The racial demographics of the neighborhood really changed in the 1970s or like 60s and 70s as globalization and deindustrialization began to occur in cities, which meant that like manufacturing really left cities. It really changed when highways were built and the suburbs were built. So, you know, in Sunset Park, that is the Gowanus Expressway, which kind of cuts Sunset Park off from its waterfront. And it really changed, and it really allowed for the process which we know as white flight, which is, you know, white folks who have predominantly been living in cities moving out to the suburbs, kind of spurred down by, you know, cheap access to home loans through the GI Bill. And the construction of highways, you know, the history of Robert Moses and all that. This is a long conversation I'm not going to get too deep into. So I mentioned that Sunset Park changed a lot in the 70s. So this is a map of Sunset Park taken from Community Board 7 from 1969. This image is actually taken from an art exhibit curated by Betty Yu, Displaced in Sunset Park. And it kind of shows the borders of Sunset Park, including Greenwood Cemetery, which we talked about earlier. So, you know, post deindustrialized Sunset Park really meant that, you know, manufacturing jobs, which was the economic driver of the working class in the neighborhood, had really left the city and really impacted this particular neighborhood. This neighborhood was redlined, as we talked about earlier, which meant that folks didn't have access to cheap home loans or home insurance. And this neighborhood, you know, post white folks moving out after white flight and during the immigration changes that happened in 1965. So there was this big like immigration law that changed in 1965, which basically lifted quotas that restricted immigrants from Asia, from Latin America, and from countries in Africa to migrate in. So in the 1960s and 70s, we began to see a huge influx of immigrants into places like New York, and particularly into places like Sunset Park. So now in Sunset Park, it's still a predominantly immigrant neighborhood, but the immigrant groups have changed. It's predominantly Latinx on one side of Sunset Park. On the side I don't know what that is, west of 6th Avenue. And then, you know, it's also the home of the largest Chinatown in Brooklyn, and that's along the 8th Avenue side. Along the Sunset Park waterfront are two kind of major institutions that we have been struggling with. One is Industry City, which is pictured on the left-hand side. I pulled this picture from their website. It shows a super gentrified courtyard with Christmas lights and I guess what I would say as a vision of a space designed for people to kind of come and be consumers, for middle-class people to come and be consumers in this place. If you were to kind of travel up along the Sunset Park waterfront, it's really Industry City. And then there's a Amazon fulfillment center. And then there's MDC Brooklyn, which is a federal jail here in Brooklyn. And the picture here on MDC Brooklyn on the right was taken from protests outside of MDC Brooklyn in early 2019, when the jail, during one of the coldest weeks of the summer, when the jail was not turned off the heat and hot water to folks who were locked inside. And people were kind of outside doing a lot of noise demos in that to try to force the conditions to be better in the jail. Okay, so a little bit of situation in Sunset Park. So I guess the last thing I would say about Sunset Park geography is that Sunset Park has been fighting gentrification kind of along multiple fronts. On one front is really along the waterfront around Industry City. And then along the other side, it's also gentrification along the 8th Avenue Chinatown side of Sunset Park. A lot of these projects, these mega developments that are proposed for the neighborhood have been funded by foreign capital, global transnational capital. A lot of everything that I understand about this, I learned from Tari Hum. And I guess, so I actually wanted to share a quote from an article that Tari and Sam Stein co-wrote on the future of work in the future of work in New York City's Chinatowns. So here they write, whereas US Chinatowns were developed as strategies to absorb Chinese surplus workers and provide for their social reproduction in a manner that generally benefited US manufacturing capital. Today, these neighborhoods are being shaped as strategies to absorb Chinese surplus capital, to provide lucrative investment opportunities for transnational capitalists in a manner that largely benefits US real estate capital, including local immigration growth coalitions. And I think that this really kind of traces out the changes in urban life and the changes in Sunset Park, in which the city and this particular neighborhood have gone from one that was really thriving on manufacturing and industry to one in which the city planning has really kind of forced this growth model of gentrification onto the neighborhood. Okay, and then the last thing I wanted to talk about a little bit was the organizing formations that led to the formation of Sunset Park Popular Assembly. So we're a group that started as a cop watch team in the neighborhood in 2014. This was shortly after the NYPD murder of Eric Garner in Staten Island. Our first patrol was the Puerto Rican Day Parade of 2014, which the Puerto Rican Day Parade was actually last weekend. So this marks our, I guess, 7th birthday as a group. So that first summer that we cop watched as a group in the neighborhood, at the Puerto Rican Day Parade, the police violently broke it up at the end when they were trying to arrest a group of teens, and they were pepper spraying Sunset Park residents pretty indiscriminately to break up the group. And then later on in the summer at the 5th Avenue Festival, which is organized by the 5th Avenue BID, the Business Improvement District, there was 2 other incidents of one, a young man who was selling fruit was detained and handcuffed on the ground and kicked by the police officers even after he was detained. And the second of a pregnant woman who was thrown to the ground. All of these incidents were recorded by cop watchers on the scene. And I think that a lot of these incidents kind of highlight a lot of what we're talking about in terms of the relationship between policing and gentrification, which is that the policing in neighborhoods like Sunset Park, which is based on broken windows policing and quality of life policing, specifically targets young people, it targets immigrants, it targets queer people, it targets Black and Latinx people. And it works at the behest of landlords, of business owners in the neighborhood, in terms of reshaping Sunset Park into a desired image. So I think that the imagery of Industry City as Industry City, a development for wealthy folks to come and be consumers, Amazon Fulfillment Center as a place in which people are exploited for their cheap labor, and then MDC Brooklyn as a place in which people are incarcerated when their labor is no longer necessary. And it's no coincidence that they're all there and they're all next to each other and the buildings all almost look the same from the outside. To talk a little bit more about the assembly itself, I'm gonna pass it to Giselle. And I think, yeah, go ahead, Giselle.
Hey everyone, just to reintroduce myself, I'm Giselle Jimenez. I am a woman, I use she, her pronouns of Dominican Taino descent. I have light skin and short black hair. I'm wearing a black shirt with yellow earrings. And I know Sean through the Popular Assembly, but we didn't meet until kind of that began to form. So in those years leading up to the Popular Assembly, I was kind of off doing my own thing. So that's what I want to share a little bit about. I'm not a doctor or a graduate student. I just got my Bachelor of Fine Arts in studio art. So I'm not really an expert in anything other than my lived experience. So I hope that you can gain something from it. So yeah, as was mentioned, I was born and raised in Sunset Park, but my family immigrated here in the 60s from the Dominican Republic. And although I was born and raised here and I've been here my whole life, I felt very disconnected from the neighborhood for a very long time when I was growing up. I just didn't really have many friends or a network in the neighborhood, and especially because in high school and college, I went to college in Manhattan. So my kind of adolescent and adult life friendships were being formed outside of the neighborhood. But moving outside of the neighborhood is actually kind of what began my politicization. I don't know if that's the right word, or if that is a word. But when I went to this high school, I went to Beacon High School, if anyone's familiar in New York City, and it serves a very different population than Sunset Park, which is a poor working class immigrant neighborhood. And the people that were, being served at this school were much more affluent, a lot less of a diverse student body population, and the quality of the education and the resources that we had there were very different. I realized how underfunded things were. I realized that not everyone in New York City is poor. I thought that you just like move to Florida when you make money because it's kind of the narrative. So yeah, I was very sheltered, as you can tell, as a child. But so at that point, when I started realizing, there's a world outside of our neighborhood and realizing all the factors at play, that was around the time that the Industry City rezoning was kind of being talked about more, and it was more of an area of struggle. And so because I didn't know anyone really in the neighborhood at that time, I kind of just was showing up to community board meetings and things like that on my own and just doing my own personal research. And I didn't really have a sense of community, but eventually over time, I started seeing a lot of the same faces, and I started learning about all these different groups that have been organizing and just kind of catching up. But I didn't really feel comfortable affiliating with any specific group until I learned more. So I was going to like nonprofit organizations, the Democratic Socialist, who I didn't even know that was a thing. There were like coalition marches that I went on, like my first protest, different public hearings around the rezoning, and also like town hall meetings. And the common thread that I was noticing, and a big part of why I never felt comfortable kind of aligning myself with one group, was because I felt like no matter what, on whatever end of the spectrum you were on, there was always one person or group of people that were in control of the narrative or the dialogue that was taking place. And so that could look like, for example, like that echo chamber sort of effect that happens when we're all repeating like the same buzzwords and chants that are kind of being created by one person or group of people with certain interests. Or it could look like the time our council member, Carlos Menchaca, walked out on a town hall meeting that he was hosting in a school auditorium. And he didn't like how things were going, so he stormed off and he shut the lights off on us in the school auditorium and left us in the pitch black darkness. But shout out to some folks from Protect Sunset Park, who are a group that have been really big in the organizing against Industry City. They kept the meeting going. They went up, they took the mic, and they were like, "We came here to talk, and we're going to do that. We came here to hear the community." And I think that's when something clicked for me, right? Like when everyone like took their phones out and put like the flashlight on and we're like, we're gonna keep going. I realized like this is what we need. We need a space where we can come together and not have politicians or landlords or big CEOs, like all of these people in power, dictating how the conversation goes, dictating um, our ability to strategize and to just hear from each other. And so that's kind of when I started asking these questions. But I also began to realize that, even without those people in power present, those same faces that I kept seeing at all these meetings were kind of the same crowd of like young, college educated, or just generally young folks, the same kind of like activist circle. And it began to feel to me that the sectors of our neighborhood, the popular sectors of our neighborhood, were not really able to contribute to the conversation in a way that I felt like they needed to be. And so I'm talking about like, parents who work all day, who work several jobs, who can't come to these meetings, or disabled people, or elderly people, or people with who don't speak English or speak limited English. There's all of these people that I felt like needed to be here, needed to be listening and learning, but also like they have things to offer us as well. And so at that point is when I was connected to a group of folks in the neighborhood who were asking similar questions and noticing the same need. And that's when the Popular Assembly started to come into formation. So Sean, I don't know if you want to share a little bit about that moving forward.
Yeah, thank you, Giselle. That was really helpful and grounding. I guess that I would just add that part of our intention in organizing popular assemblies was really to kind of do what Giselle said, to like try to create space for the popular sectors of Sunset Park to have a place to build with each other, whether it be politically or just to be building community. We don't have an issue. We don't have like a central issue that we all agreed on, that we worked on. A lot of the stuff that we organize around kind of grows naturally out of the conversations that we have. And that the popular assembly model is something that we learned from a lot of other folks doing the work. And actually, just to keep my comments brief, we can talk a little bit more about that if I think there's a conversation on collaboration and stuff. But let me pass it back to you, Giselle.
Yeah, so as Sean mentioned, like we have been learning from other groups, and this process started kind of end of 2019, and then when the pandemic struck is when things kind of really solidified, and we had been kind of laying the groundwork, and then when we suddenly were all isolated from each other, there was this really strong desire to kind of come together and have that space. So we held like a virtual meeting, and it was kind of our first like real assembly. And from that point on, things have evolved so much, and the assembly has taken many different forms and shapes. And right now, we're kind of in like a recess and reevaluation period. But so many efforts that have emerged from that moment in time are still going on. So there's the organizing at MDC, there's the tenants union, there's mutual aid projects. And so despite the fact that we haven't all convened together in a while, there's still like a lot of amazing work that's being done that's really exciting. But what I wanted to share a little bit right now, just to kind of tie in this idea of collective imagination. Betty Yu, the host of this panel, she had asked us to contribute to an exhibition that she curated at Apex Art Center. And part of it was this radical housing manifesto. And so our contribution was a few of the members of the group came together and created a sort of fiction piece that was imagining the future of Sunset Park. And so I'll just share a few excerpts from that, but just to kind of get the, well, actually, I'll just go for it. So just to credit who the writers are, we called it Sunset Park 2040. And so just to set the scene, it's been 15 years since the uprising. Members of the Sunset Park Popular Assembly reflect on daily life in liberated East Lenape-Hoking and how they each contribute to their community. And so we each created fictional characters. So these names that you're about to see are not real people. So first is San, age 20. My day began early, harvesting pumpkins in the milpa that surrounds Sunset Park. In between poking around the prickly leaves and vines for ripe pumpkins, I'd watch my neighbors go about their morning routines. I spotted my compa Valerie from the youth council passing by on Fifth Ave and waved. Buenos dias, son, she called from the street. See you tonight. Working at the milpa can be hard work, but I enjoy this rotation of my urban agroecology apprenticeship more than the oyster and seaweed cooperative at Jamel Floyd Park. I'll take scratchy vines over the freezing water any day. Most of what's produced by the farm cooperatives gets distributed to local schools, and it feels good knowing that my work contributes to my community's health and autonomy. Jay, age 43. Over breakfast, the kids asked us to tell them stories about when we were children. It's always fascinating to see their reactions. Even though it hasn't been that long, their world is so different. Today, I told them about the time I got my hair cut short for the first time. I loved how my new haircut looked on me, but when I went to school, the kids all laughed at me. One of the teachers even scolded me when I went to the bathroom, saying, "This is the girls' restroom." I tried to explain how stressful it was, but Sophia and Celeste just giggled. They thought it was so silly that my short hair was such a big deal. Auntie Suad chimed in. You think that's strange? 15 years ago, we couldn't even come here without permission from the government. We tried for years and years, but they just wouldn't give us that damn piece of paper. They rarely gave them to people like us. The kids twisted their faces in perplexion. They've heard about borders and visas and citizenship before, since many of our friends, families, and neighbors have stories. Stories about living in the shadows, stories about being separated from loved ones by invisible lines in the sand, stories about crossing those lines, only to suffer exploitation and oppression on the other side, and stories of being placed inside dark, cold cells. But they still don't totally understand. I don't think I would either. People have freedom to move now, and no longer have to fear being thrown into cold, dark cell by the government. And finally, Esperanza, age 84. In the years leading to the uprising, those young people reminded me our city was made of islas too, and that we lived on earth and among rivers that could still sustain us and teach us and heal us if only we cared for the land in return. They reminded me we still had each other and that we needed each other. They said they even needed me. I'd been alone for so long I had forgotten what that felt like. How could I have known my stories would be fuel for a revolution? How could my mother have known my name, Esperanza, would be prophetic? Now I serve with the Elders' Council of the Popular Assembly, guided by Lenape elders to revive and preserve the knowledge that took generations to accumulate. This month, we on the Safety Committee prepared a discussion series on peacemaking and restorative justice practices in other communities in order to continue developing our own practices in Sunset Park. Tonight we'll study the Mamas of Rojava, a group of women elders in liberated Syria who have kept their community safe by serving as mediators between the families they already know and love. So if you want to read the whole thing, I think it's dropped in the chat, but I hope that gives a little bit of an idea of the hope that we have for this assembly. We might not be there exactly yet, but I think that's what's really special about coming together with other people, is that you just kind of can dream together in like the cheesiest way possible and believe that it's possible and continue to work towards it together.
Thank you so much. That was beautiful. Thank you, Giselle and Sean. That was amazing. So appropriate to, yeah, I think someone just put appreciation in the chat as well. Such an appropriate way to wrap up your presentation. And yes, we'll definitely get back to talking about collectivity and mutuality that I know are fundamental principles of the assembly. So that really came through, and thank you for talking about that. The next speaker that I'll be that will be presenting, and please definitely, you probably all had the link from the event, and you can read full bios of everyone. Really amazing speakers and a lot of experience in organizing cultural work and scholarship. So invite you all to check that out. But I'll briefly introduce our next speaker, Dr. Lisa K. Bates. Is associate professor at Portland State University in the Tulane School of Urban Studies and Planning, and is Portland professor in innovative housing policy. Her scholarship focuses on housing and community development, policy and planning, and her research and practice aims to build new models for emancipatory planning practices and to dismantle institutional racism. Dr. Bates' work includes deep engagements with community-based organizations working towards racial justice and housing rights, and supporting the Portland Anti-Displacement Coalition. So please, please, please give a round of applause. I know no one can clap, but I'm so excited that Lisa is here, and I'm gonna hand it off to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. And my name's Lisa. I'm a Black woman with a short Afro haircut, brown face, light brown skin, dangly earrings. I am in what is currently known as Portland on the Chinook Nation lands, and I really appreciate being here with you all today virtually. So I'm gonna share a little bit about work that I've been doing over several years. I say I, but it's really a we. It's a very capacious we. A lot of collaborators who have taken part in these practices to try to build a radical Black spatial imagination in Portland, Oregon. If you know little about Portland, Oregon, it is America's whitest big city, typically known for sustainability, coffee brew pubs, not really for Black community. Lately has been the faux epicenter of Antifa, but we're out here just being regular folks and dealing with the same kinds of issues that we just heard about from Chinatown Art Brigade and Sunset Park Assembly, because although Portland sometimes thinks of itself as being unique or a keep Portland weird kind of place, it's actually very much like every place, every city. So I appreciate that Sean started his presentation with redlining maps. Of course, there was redlining in Portland too. And for Portland's Black community, after being redlined into Northeast Portland, was a site of repeated continuous displacement through the state violence of urban renewal practices. These are just some of the images of Portland's Black community being torn down to build our sports stadium, convention center complex, and highway system trenches. It's been really important in my work here with the community that we have a really careful practice also of bringing imagery of Portland's history that can speak to the real temporal or time-based nature of these actions of demolition, of destruction, of expropriation by the state. This image here is On the left is typically what is shown in Portland when people talk about urban renewal. This black and white photo that's clearly from many decades before the actual activities of the Portland Development Commission. This area here was the heart of the Black Business District. It was completely demolished in 1973. So that picture in color is a more contemporary photo of what it looked like when the city tore down these buildings. That site where the cupola stands is now still 40 years later, a totally vacant lot. It is this full city block that has been left completely vacant. That used to be part of a thriving business district. So part of the work that I've done collectively with folks here is to try to not only remember those stories, but to make sure that as we describe those histories, that we do so in a way that is very clear about, as this quote here says, the institutional destruction of life. It was, of course, not an accident that this area was demolished, and it was not an accident that it remains vacant decades later. At the same time, it's been equally important to work to recover, to reconstruct and reclaim the stories of resistance to urban renewal, to gentrification. So finding those documents that don't exist in the city's archives, but exist in the folders in the back of a closet, or the office of a community organization that's in the middle of a move, that where there's a Xeroxed packet of papers, for example, here in the Interstate Alliance to End Displacement, Black-led organizing, to push back against Hope 6 of public housing redevelopment projects of the mid to late 90s, and another urban renewal designation. Portland hasn't even sort of rebranded what is urban renewal. We still say urban renewal areas, and in 2000 a new urban renewal area was created, but there was very active Black organizing and resistance to talk about that. So in this work together with the community, really important to me that as we envision the future, that we're actually reconstructing, reclaiming, and reimagining the past, present, and future all together, actively restoring the past visions of what the future would be. So to ask, what did the Interstate Alliance to End Displacement think that 2020 or 2021 should look like? It allows us to make the world that we're inhabiting now, not so certain. We think of the present as a place of certainty, but when we see how the past envisioned their future, which is our present, we realize that it didn't have to be this way. It makes the present strange, as my friend Annie Coe says. So then we can better understand how other nows were possible, and therefore other futures are not only possible, but are already existing to be claimed. That we have to envision and imagine those futures, and that way we can work backwards to understand the path that we need to get to be there, right? And so, I am an urban planner by training and education. Urban planning has been, urban planning is not the originator of state violence or racism, but it is a very powerful technology of racial capitalism. It is a very powerful and constantly adjusting technology for white supremacy, and for carceral systems, starting with the creation of private property, use of zoning and land use tools. So one of my practices with community has been to try to reclaim planning, not as a professionalized activity, but as an activity of human beings thinking about the future and the visions that we have, to create a people's plan that starts from the recognition that Black communities are valuable and meaningful, exactly the opposite of what our traditional urban planning values, in which the presence of Blackness in a place inherently makes that place blighted and inherently makes that place a target for so-called revitalization. But to really assert a right to be in and to make place, to be reflected in place and to shape the future of places, and to have a form of participation that is open to not only the people who are so-called qualified to appear at a public meeting and talk in a microphone or give a PowerPoint presentation, but every Black person whose lived experience and life experience is being brought to the conversation. So rather than have the people's plan begin by asking, sort of like, on a scale of 1 to 5, do you like or not like this particular program or policy? But we invited our participants to ask questions. And some of those questions that were surfaced brought us to a new sort of lens through which to think about how we would move forward with the plan. So asking questions about, why don't we take ownership of gentrified spaces? How can we reappropriate spaces in one of the most gentrified cities in the country, which Black presence is being erased on a daily basis? But also to engage with the affective nature of gentrification and displacement. How much anger do we have to swallow to think we deserve these spaces? And how much permission do we need to have to create these spaces for ourselves? The idea of claiming physical real space has become an animating feature of this work. So we wanted to build and create this vision of Black community, Black people across our city, whether in historical Black neighborhoods in Northeast Portland, but any place that Black people have landed in this sort of new multi-diasporas, to say, we're here, we're out here, and we are claiming this space. And then also to make sure that that gets linked to a really collective work to not only have a vision sort of in the imagination, like way out here into the future, but what is the organizing work that we have to do? What is the organizing work that we do, that we already do, in order to make those plots and plans for how we can get there? So this image here is from a neighborhood art exhibit in the Humboldt neighborhood, which is adjacent to Oregon's only majority Black high school, working with high school students and also Black women and femmes who are organizing across a number of issues to try to create plots and plans around the idea that we make what's possible, to think about the history of Black Portland's organizing, and then also create, as we move out the timeline, the plans and projects and ideas for how we would move toward those possibilities that people began to define. That we would also connect that to very specific political moments. So in the, not the immediately past, but previous mayoral election, working on a postcard campaign, Dear Next Mayor. I'm a Black Portlander, and my future needs the following: to de-gentrify, to establish Black space and Black presence, and to try to build up our sort of organizing muscles to work collectively together toward that. Also to sort of concretize our work, as we realize that abolition is the framework through which this complete emancipation and liberation could be achieved, that it requires us to imagine a world in which no person has ever been subjugated, but to imagine that that idea had never been created on this earth, that it would never have been a valid possibility to own and buy and sell another person's body, to lock a person up in a cage for decades at a time. brings us to completely new ideas and visions. And so we're also building our capacity around participatory action research. And so it's really, when Giselle was saying, you know, I'm not a doctor, I'm not an expert, it really, it hits me in my heart, because in this work, my knowledge, the knowledge that I bring as a person with a very specific kind of formal education, I have to recognize not only as no more valid, certainly no more useful, but also as coming actually out of a space that is deeply harmful. That our knowledge, so-called knowledge, in academia or in policy research, is actually deeply dehumanizing for Black people, for poor Black people, and especially for poor Black mothers who have always been seen as being irrational or incapable of thinking about choices in their lives and making good choices, have always been seen as having a distorted understanding of what makes places and spaces good and healthy and healing. And so when I enter this collective work in community to create a space of research justice and data justice, much of what I'm doing is, again, not just leaving the academic knowledge that I have at the door, but actually like actively trying to scour many of those things from my mind. And so we have been working on a research justice and data justice focused on the idea of justice and dignity in the housing space. How can we activate the understanding that people have about what's going on for them, particularly now in the pandemic with housing instability, in a way that does not mean people telling their own stories of trauma and living in their own worst moments continually. That's been incredibly important to the collective participants, that they want to speak the truth about what is happening, their knowledge and understanding about how power works in systems of capitalism and the capitalist housing market, without their own, without disempowering themselves, but actually working together to build power by acknowledging the knowledge that people have. Unsurprisingly, this conversation in the last year has immediately turned into some work around evictions and the recognition that eviction and carceral processes are the same, right? That eviction is part of our carceral system of punishment of people for being poor. So what does it look like to start a research project by asking, well, if we could put an eviction moratorium in place for a year, why couldn't we have that forever? Why would we ever need to have evictions? Why would we ever need to have people have contact with not only court systems, but also with law enforcement officers in their home and in their housing space? And so we have been working on that project and then connecting that to a larger set of participatory action research projects that will be launched not only around the connection between police and prisons and gentrification, but also around a spatial exclusion through policing, and how we can build a regenerative green economy that detaches us from the ways that our carceral economy appear to be, economic development or economic growth activities, particularly as we look across Oregon, where our prison system is in rural, predominantly or almost entirely white areas, and is incarcerating Black and Brown people from Portland. So how do we disentangle the kind of economic and political power shifting that happens when our system transports human people who are disenfranchised into other geographies, where they then become part of an economic development activity, frankly. And so our work continues from these projects of participatory action research and these projects of visions, and I'll leave it with one of our participants, our young participants in the People's Plan. For us, the idea of liberation and emancipation is an idea about love. It's an idea about our love of being Black, our love of Black community and Black people, and asking the question, what would it be like if this city loved Black people as much as we love being Black? And one of our young participants said, if Portland loved Black people, it would be the best city it pretends to be. And so I think our work is to hold, in a very concrete way, our city to account, and to hold ourselves and each other in the most capacious love that we can possibly create. Thanks.
That was amazing. Thank you so much. As always, drop the mic. Such a great way to close out. I love that quote. I just love what you were saying before about the, kind of the participatory action research, and it's so grounded in people's experiences, and they are the ones who are, really the experts of their own experiences and conditions. And how do you sort of, kind of challenge the educational system, the formal educational system that, like you said, dehumanizes us and takes that away from us. Like, our knowledge base is right there, our own experiences, and how to use it to build on it, advance our collective power. So that was just really powerful when you talked about that. So thank you so much for your presentation, and of course to Shawn and Giselle. So one question we wanted to toss out to you all, and then we're going to monitor the chat. So if folks have questions that they want to ask in the audience, please chime in under the webinar Q&A. One question we wanted to put out is actually along the lines of building collective power, as you all have been talking about, but more specifically, how are principles, and it's pretty evident in your presentations so far, but if you could talk a little bit about the principles of collaboration, community organizing, and mutuality, how does that inform your work, especially now in this last, year and a half? If you can talk a little bit about those principles, and maybe we could, so we can let Lisa breathe a little bit. Maybe we can toss it to either Giselle or Shawn first, and then come back to Dr. Bates.
So first, a disclaimer: my dad and my grandma just got home, and they're like shouting in the next room. So just being authentic. I think something that comes to mind when I think about this was just how valuable those early meetings were for the assembly, when we had different working groups, but there was so much overlap. And I just think about, for example, there was an instance where there was someone who had just been released from MDC, from the prison, and he didn't have anywhere to stay. He didn't really have a family network, and like all the different working groups kind of came together and pulled their knowledge and resources together. So like the tenants union, the mutual aid group, the MDC like advocacy group, like it was just necessary for all of us to kind of give what we could, whether that was like knowledge, whether that was like financial resources. And I think that, yeah, I guess that would be my answer. Just kind of creating opportunities for that to happen by acknowledging like the overlap and all the different struggles.
Yeah, I guess the thing that I would share was the actual practice of the Popular Assembly itself. Was something that we learned from people who are organizing similar popular assemblies in other parts of the world. We had conversations with folks who are organizing popular assemblies in LA, in Puerto Rico, in Chile, and in Jackson, Mississippi. And so, I think that a lot of the way that we think about our organizing is really trying to identify the work that we're doing, the struggles that we are facing with the struggles that are happening in other places, and to learn from each other and to support each other's work. So, when we were organizing around the industry city rezoning, we had learned a lot from folks facing similar rezoning fights in other parts of the city, the rezonings being proposed in the Bronx and in Queens and in Chinatown. And, you know, learn some very specific things that we didn't have much expertise in around how the ULIP process works, what are some moments to interject. And more importantly, I think that we learn to show up for each other's struggles and like how BS the system is too, you know? And, you know, a lot of the groups were like, I'd say kind of autonomously organized groups that were left of the traditional New York City nonprofits. And I think that a lot of what Giselle kind of began opened her comments with around the ways that some spaces feel like there are already particular predetermined talking points or agendas there, I think was something that we really wanted to avoid. And, you know, I think that, so, you know, I think a lot of our organizing practice has been like learned, and we're always reflecting and evaluating. And I guess it's challenging, you know, something that Corbin, who's a Sunset Park Popular Assembly member, shared with Giselle and I when we were prepping yesterday, was around, you know, the tenants union was working to support a tenant who was being harassed by their landlord, right? Like, and harassed to the extent in which the only way that they felt safe was to call the cops. And then it became a conversation between, you know, folks in the Popular Assembly and the tenants union with the tenant around the reasons why we don't call cops, you know, like what engaging in the carceral response to calling police is, but also trying to understand their lived reality, right? And really trying to like negotiate those spaces in which we're opening dialogue, trying to have conversations about our principles, but also trying to understand that folks deal with real shit, and, you know, to like kind of move from there.
Dr. Bates, did you?
For real. Yeah, so I think about this question in the context of anti-displacement coalition, which you mentioned. So it's grassroots oriented groups from around the city of Portland, and it's been a multi-year process of building that solidarity and cooperation. I think one of the sort of tricks of Portland, which, you know, again, it's not unique, is to take the deep connection that people have to place and work that into a way of actually wedging and pitting communities against each other. It's a way of defining, like, there's one space that is the Black neighborhood, and it's this part of Northeast Portland only. There is the Jade District, that's the only place for Asians. There's Cully, that's where the Latinos are. Like, and then pit those places and communities against each other. And so a lot of what ADPDX has done over the years has been to try to develop a sense of solidarity and a sense of mutuality, to say that no matter what is displacing our people, it's all part of the same thing. There's one part that's gentrifying and one part where it's people squeezing manufactured homes, and one part where it's a transit extension. It's all the same thing, and we're in it together. And also to understand very deeply the unique histories and situations, starting from Indigenous people here, talking about the Black community. How did Black people get here in the first place? And why are they where they are now? Understanding much of the very, very lost, very actively destroyed histories of Portland's Chinatown, of Sikh communities in Portland that were violently attacked in the past. And so I know my friend Roshni Thakur from Apanos on here, and their work has been to lift up those histories and to recognize that we are actually all in this together, and we don't have to accept and put up with the cities like little dribs and drabs that they set up. So I think that kind of mutuality and solidarity and just insistence on our own definition has been really critical in that work.
Yeah, you've all touched on this a little bit already in each of your presentations, but wondering if you can speak a little bit more about the role of futurisms and radical imaginations in our movements. How do you think about these terms? Like, how do you put them into practice? Why is it important for movements to do this kind of visioning work? I'm really struck by like the resonances across your presentations of Lisa, you talking about like going back to the past and resurfacing people's visions for the future, and also, of course, just all your powerful reading from the piece Sunset Park 2040. And yeah, how do you guys think about this work? And also, like, we oftentimes think of the capitalism as is trying to script the future so much and constantly invest ideas into the future, but how do our movements also like have a stake in that, and have like, what do they put forth in terms of like another way of thinking about investing the future?
I guess I can go first. Yeah, thank you for the question, Linda. When I think about like futurity in the context of organizing work, I really think about when like towards the end of her life, Grace Lee Boggs, who's an activist organizer from Detroit, talked a lot about visionary organizing. And for folks who may not be familiar with Grace or James Boggs and the work of the Boggs Center, I think that something that was really important to them was to kind of understand the conditions that we're living in right now. So, you know, in Detroit, it's really easy to understand that racial capitalism doesn't work, right? If you were to pass through Detroit and see all the empty, abandoned warehouses and factories, it's very obvious that the system that exists isn't working for people. And I think that the premise of visionary organizing is that it doesn't make sense to go and protest for living wages. And we have to really understand where we're at in the context of these global structures of race and capitalism. And in that, I think that part of their work is really around both organizing alternative institutions that provide for people the basic needs that people have, the need for food, for shelter, for clothing. And then also to like reimagine the ways that we interact with each other as a community, and the ways that we need to ourselves shift and learn and grow and kind of, you know, go through those uncomfortable processes to create the world that we want to see. And I think that the ways that Dr. Bates talked about, you know, I feel like I couldn't say it as articulately as you did, but manifesting the future that we want really is part of this spirit. So just want to uplift thinking about that. Yeah.
I feel like with this question, I think a lot about like looking into the past, as everyone has been sharing. And so for example, with the fiction piece that we wrote, I wrote the portion about Esperanza, the 84-year-old woman. And that was very directly inspired by my grandmother, whom I live with, as I mentioned. And I just think a lot about the role that she plays in our neighborhood. And when I think about the future, I think about the fact that I'm going to be her age one day. And so she is, you know, a future version of herself. And if you read the rest of the piece, actually, like I talk about, you know, memories of the Dominican Republic and growing up on the farm, and like how they were able to kind of have that dignity of like sustaining themselves, and things like that. But then and then I mean, I don't know if this is like controversial to mention, but a big part of my radical imagination is like my faith and my personal beliefs, and that also like is directly connected to my grandmother and like how she serves in the church. And so I haven't really been super plugged into the popular assembly, but right now I've been leaning more into like basically like, how do I radicalize my church? And how do I like take advantage of the fact that we have this tight-knit community already, and that mutual aid is something that already happens so organically within churches and faith organizations. And then if we're talking about looking into the past, like I think about like the early church, you know, in the Middle East, and thinking about how the very first thing that they did was they all took all their possessions and brought it all together and redistributed it amongst themselves. And I'm like, you know, it's something that people have been doing. It's not this new concept like mutual aid and understanding that we need to like redistribute our resources and look out for each other. Especially at that time, at that time, Christians were like, and in that context, Christians were marginalized people, so they had no choice but to like lean on each other. And so, yeah, so for me, imagining the future is so much about like, you know, there there's everything is cyclical, you know, and I feel like we can learn a lot about, you know, across geographies and like looking at other places at this current moment, but also looking into the past.
I want to know what Betty and Linda, what you think about the future. I mean, Linda started off by quoting Ruth Wilson Gilmore saying we have to change only one thing, which is everything. So that's a lot. That requires a lot.
Mhm.
I want to write it down. What you're saying.
Go for it, Linda. I love how the tables are turned.
Yeah.
Dun, dun, dun.
No, I don't know. I just think what you were saying, to turn it kind of back to you, about trying to rethink the work of urban planning, or like that the future is just the domain of like planners and capitalists, and I don't know, just trying to think maybe it's not futurity, but it's something else that we're articulating.
And just to chime in, something I think Linda or Lisa, I can't remember who said it, but this idea that within this capitalist system, you know, everyone talks about gentrification and capitalism and, you know, prisons as if they're inevitable. Like it's just, that's just going to happen into, you know, the future. Like that's just a given. There's no way you can challenge that. And that's that obviously the sort of internalized, you know, kind of thinking that we want to like also, you know, really challenge and put out a different kind of framework. And so like the work of, you know, Sunset Park Popular Assembly, and also you, Dr. Bates, and all the work that you've done. And I put some links if folks want to check out if you scroll up, but some of the work you've done around Black spatial like imaginary, just really incredible. And obviously you shared that in your presentation. But I think that, you know, that this actually can be possible. Like we can actually enact this together, and that it's not just something that is so far. That's why, you know, I think specifically we use words like futurisms or radical reimagination, not utopia, right? Because utopia to me doesn't really get at it, and it really erases a lot of the inequity, and we know that we're not in a level playing field anyway to begin with. But anyway, but yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot about urban planning that has to get thrown in the absolute garbage. I mean, because planning is about the future. I mean, that's like what I went to school and they taught us to project things into the future, but it imagines this like linear progression, and yeah, gentrification is going to happen, and probably it's good for the most part. That's the other thing. Like on balance, you know, this is fine. And so it's like really fighting to totally to reclaim the future for people. Like the future, we're going to make the future, we're going to enact it together, like you just said. We're not just going to let this like roll forward. That's not going to work.
Yeah, totally. What do you think, Linda? Should we go to, there's actually questions in the chat, should we go to that instead of the last question that we had prepped? I feel like in our last 10 minutes maybe we should do that. So I'm just going to read the questions out, if that's cool. And let's just see here. Sorry. So Todd asked, I don't know if Todd, if you, I will just ask it for you. I'm not sure if you can unmute. I always forget with these webinars, but I'll read it. So Todd asked, as people nested in growing popular assemblies bottom up, how do you negotiate, or do you negotiate local and national electoral politics. And I think Sean is typing in an answer, but if you also want to verbalize it, that's cool too.
I didn't realize you could see that I was beginning to type in.
Oh, only I can. I'm sorry. Only I can see. I think. I mean, us hosts.
Todd, to answer your question, we don't engage with electoral politics collectively as a popular assembly. We don't work with elected officials. We generally, as a rule, don't invite elected officials to speak at our events. Like last year, we did a lot of organizing outside of the federal jail in the neighborhood, and a lot of elected officials wanted to come and speak. And we didn't see what the purpose was other than their own platforming. That said, that there are ways that we have thought about strategically, like applying pressure on elected officials. Like something that we might ask an elected official to do would be to potentially visit the federal jail and to ask for a tour inside. But yeah, we generally don't provide a platform for electeds to promote themselves.
But on that note, this is my personal perspective. I definitely agree with like not letting like politicians and elected officials like co-opt the movement. But I know that a big part of like the strategy against Industry City was like lobbying. And that wasn't necessarily the Popular Assembly, but other groups in the neighborhood. And I think it's just important to have like a range of strategies and allow for that, because like as long as it's not like they're doing anything that's like harmful, but if we're all working towards a common goal, like yes, in this radical imagination of the future, like there are no elected officials, but like they're here now. So like what are we gonna like what do we do about it? Like how do we contend with that? And I don't have the answers, but I think it's also like I don't know if it's helpful to kind of make things so clear cut, like yes or no, like just allowing for a range of possibilities.
Yeah, cool. Thank you so much for answering that. And then our final question, and we'll kind of close right after that. I guess it's appropriate to kind of talk a little bit more about ways that folks can kind of do this organizing. And I think that, Sean, you had mentioned, across the city, learning from other anti-zoning, organizing campaigns, folks who, were really, there's the policy piece of it, the zoning, but there's also the, like you said, the grassroots mobilization, which the people power, which will obviously push for those changes, right? Not just policy alone. But in general, I'm wondering, as we look at, these across from Portland to New York City and all around this country, a lot of the gentrification is state sanctioned, right, by zoning laws, working with developers, and they look really similar. What are the possibilities for our movements, anti-displacement, decolonizing, abolition movements across? I know this is a big question, but your thoughts on how we can build solidarity across distance, because there is so much commonality and so much common struggle and conditions that we all face. And I think that will be the final question for the evening. So if anyone wants to dive in, please do. So how do we build this solidarity? I don't like that word solidarity, but for lack of a better term, solidarity. Yeah.
Well, I think, this helps. I mean, I think it's been really fascinating, like in the last year, because we have where we can use this technology. We like talk about being Zoom fatigued and stuff, but I mean, the ability to connect across the country and even internationally with people who are having the same conversations and share analysis and share strategies and share tactics to be for example, in the conversation of all of these like amazing kick-ass people working on evictions, working on eviction blockades, trying to see how to just stop, clog and block and stop that violence. because we can talk to each other and shout into into our webcams. I think it's been really powerful. I think it's really necessary, and I think that whether you worked in electoral strategies or not, or more direct action strategies, these are happen everywhere. I mean, this is happening everywhere. It's a global phenomenon. So we need to have like both our own contextual understanding of it, but also see how it is like the same thing is happening everywhere. I think for Portland specifically, because this is a small town. When we're going to talk to city council, there's 5 people. It's a small town, and so we can get stuck in our own myth making around Portland as this weird place or unique place. And so it's really actually very important to see that other people are not only facing the same things in the systems, but also face the same challenges in the organizing and keeping things going and thinking about strategies and coming up with tactics and like actually to learn across those spaces in this strange platform. It's been really important.
Yeah, I know. Strange platform is exactly what I would call it. Little boxes here. Yeah, and Sean and Giselle, any final thoughts on that?
I guess just like a quick thing to share. Our tenants union is currently in the process of becoming, I guess, officially affiliated with the Autonomous Tenants Union, if any of you have heard of it. And that's kind of like a national autonomous thing that's like apart from like nonprofit tenant unions. So that's kind of something. And then there's also like when we first launched the Popular Assembly, like one of the kind of like our soft launch, we had a meeting before the pandemic, and we had people calling in from Chile and from Puerto Rico, and that was like such a dope experience to be able to like hear from them and understand their context, because I think as marginalized as we are here in the United States, there's also the fact that like we're in the United States and there's so much privilege attached to that. So I think being able to understand the role that we play on an international, like intercommunal like level is really important.
I don't really have much to add. I feel like Lisa and Giselle really spoke really wonderfully on that. I did want to talk a little bit about how researchers and scholars can be accountable to grassroots work. I know a lot of folks here are graduate students. And I often think about how do we do our research in a way that's accountable to the communities that we work in. And I just wanted to encourage folks to really be intentional about sharing your expertise and to share your technical skills. Some things that we need on a lot of grassroots organizing, there's a lot of resources that live in the academy that are needed on the grassroots level. And just some specific things like, for the urban planners and folks like that in this space, technical knowledge around like city planning processes, which can be really opaque to community members, like, we can figure out ways to share that knowledge. Things like having expertise around GIS, how to make a map is really helpful for folks who are doing work on the ground. It helps us to visualize our work in ways that are really legible and powerful. So encouraging folks to show up to support your local grassroots organizations, coming out to like actions is great, but to really think about how do I materially contribute to these spaces too.
Great, thank you guys so much. I think Nadia, were you going to close off or show? Sorry, okay, there you go. Thank you guys so much though. I know that everybody is not able to reveal themselves or whatever, but I just wanted to just give an applause. That was really moving and I'm really, really inspired by everyone. So I just want to show deep, deep gratitude. So thank you.
Echoing that as well. Thank you all so much for your time. Really amazing presentations and I learned so much.
Thank you for creating this space for us.
Everyone should read The Sunset Park 2040 piece. Yeah, I'll hand it over to Nadia.
Thank you so much. I wish this conversation could continue. Thank you to Betty and Linda of Chinatown Art Brigade and all of our speakers this evening. I'm just going to drop our YouTube into the chat. We're a little behind because we've had a lot of videos, but all of our event recordings will be posted to YouTube. And if you go to our website and sign up for emails, you should get an email in a few weeks of all of the events, so you can just follow up and watch the first CAB event that we had earlier this season. Thank you all so much. Have a lovely evening. Bye.